The gut-brain axis. So we've learned that the commensal bacteria are in the trillions, and there are way more bacteria in our bodies, especially the gut, than there are even human cells. So we really are basically just a conglomerate of water and bacteria, and then in the midst of it, a little bit of emotion and tissue, which I think is fascinating. And we've also learned that 95% of our serotonin, one of our mood neurotransmitters, is primarily in the gut and almost completely concentrated in the rectum, which we'll see in a few in a few slides, which is fascinating again. And mood can be influenced by gut, and stress can negatively influence gut function. And we are finally in a realm of science, and this is new within only the last couple years, where we really understand how much gut health influences every part of overall health, and correlates to almost every underlying disease and symptomology, just like we know inflammation does. It's been in the last like decade that it finally came forth. uh, you know we are debunking theories that were presented in the 1950s that carried through the century of science, and we're finally like, yeah, sorry, that just wasn't right. And the gut brain is one of those where we are just exploding with science. So let's take a look at why we're doing a gut brain axis in the GI realm, and that's because it does tie to the gut bugs and how they control us and how we can control them, because it is a symbiosis. And as soon as that symbiosis is lost, basically every kind of disease can present. So we have to be friends with our gut bugs, and we have to make sure that we are keeping them in check, because otherwise they will control our lives. So let's see what that really means. So when we talk about overall health, so let's step outside of the GI system for a second, and let's just talk about living. We have stress. Stress comes from everywhere. Stress is financial, occupational, emotional, mental, social. It comes from every realm, and it's environmental, chemical, viral, like it's internal and it's external, and it's all happening at the same time, and it's layer on top of layer on top of layer. So if you are not managing your stress with whatever combination of tools and skill sets that you have been exposed to, then it is controlling you. And stress is going to be something that we need short term in little bursts, right? It does have a function, but we live in this external and internal world of just chronic stresses that never let up. And if we don't learn how to manage them, they're going to completely destroy our systems. So we're going to dive just a little bit into some of the stress responses so that we can understand how that correlates to the gut-brain axis. So I'm a big fan of Dr. Williams. This is The Role of Stress in the HPA Axis in Chronic Disease and Management. This is Point Institute. This book is phenomenal, and if you choose to go ahead and purchase this book, you have a coupon for 20% off. And this is also the same author that we are using for a very big portion of our GI module as well. So I think that this is a phenomenally written book. He's a wonderful PhD scientist, and I really like his work. So HPA axis is your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and this is a feedback loop. Most of our hormones act in a loop, right? So the brain tells the gland to secrete it, the gland secretes it, and then that serum level acts on a target tissue, has its effect, and then the serum level also travels back up by the feedback loop and tells the hypothalamus and then some of the other stimulatory parts of the brain that have receptors for it how much is there and if it's talking to each other or not. And basically the feedback is, as soon as it gets secreted and it's told to be secreted, it will inhibit the teller to tell it to stop secreting. So the feedback loop is stimulatory, gland secrete, and then the gland secretes, and then the feedback loop is the product tells the organ to stop telling me to keep secreting. right? So that's your feedback. So what we have to understand for the gut-brain axis is the HPA, and this is your stress response. So your hypothalamus is going to secrete, in regards to the stress response, your corticotropin releasing hormone, so your CRH. The CRH is going to then stimulate the pituitary, that's still way up here, it's like right there. And then your pituitary is going to secrete your adrenocorticotropin hormone, and that's your ACTH, right? So then that leaves the pituitary and travels down to the adrenal glands, which sit on top of your kidneys. They're like right there. And then those are going to primarily, under the control of your ACTH, secrete your glucocorticoid cortisol. Now, I am not doing an adrenal learning module, so we are not learning this in its entirety. I am doing just enough for us to understand the HPA axis so that we can present that to the gut-brain axis. So this is not 100% of how the adrenal gland works. However, we're going to dive into it enough that we can get a nice, good gist of it. So we are going to leave out some of the other hormones because the adrenal gland does have other functions. However, primarily under the stress response, and what we need to appreciate for gut health and for gut-brain axis is that under the stress response of the HPA axis is going to cause a large secretion of cortisol. Okay, so our ACTH is going to stimulate the adrenal gland, and we are going to get cortisol, and that is our glucocorticoid. Okay, so we look at that in a little bit more detail in just a few slides. So the hypothalamus is the major control point. However, the hypothalamus, along with your hippocampus and the amygdala, make up the limbic system. And the limbic system is going to be where we have memory formation, and we have emotional fear and anger control. And then together, these regulate different responses in the body. So when we are talking about the hypothalamus and its control, right, through the different nuclei, we have to appreciate that the hypothalamus is made up of multiple regions, and each one has a little bit of a different unique response and different neural connections, peripheral and central. And this is going to regulate and communicate in a very complex manner. However, signals from the peripheral body are going to feed up to the brain, and then the different nuclei of the hypothalamus are going to interpret it, and then we get a response. Remember, everything afferent, efferent, input, output, stimulus, response, information in, response, motor, out. Okay, so the different nuclei are going to receive signals that monitor the internal functions, right, such as circadian rhythm, appetite, body temperature, blood glucose and fluid levels, as well as thirst, and then also threat perception. And that's where the limbic system can come into play with the connections through your hippocampus and your amygdala. And then, of course, outside of the limbic system, but still a very big part of your overall existence, is that prefrontal cortex, which coordinates all types of information, as well as cognition and executive thinking. So it's this gigantic, beautiful, complex, dynamic system of communication and input. So the hypothalamus has to coordinate both internal and external threat. Now remember, we are a conglomerate of evolution. So when we are talking about threats, our complex intelligence still thinks that we are running from the saber-toothed tiger, right? We used to be cavemen, and we had to go hunt for our food, the hunter and gatherers, and that's really where intelligence in the brain is still believed to come from, in the intelligent model, even though it was a long time ago. And I guess in the form of evolution, it really wasn't that long ago. So our fight or flight response is still coordinated through this hypothalamus and then the hippocampus, the amygdala, right? Fear, anger, and interpretation of threat. So the problem with stress in modern day world is we are no longer running from a saber-toothed tiger, which is supposed to be terminal stress, right? You get out of its way or you die. Simple, right? Now we're combated with stresses in every realm, and it just never lets up. So our brain and our body are still trying to adapt to this modern age of stress. However, our brain still thinks we should be running from a saber-toothed tiger. It just thinks it never goes away. So the stress signal is going to go through the hypothalamus, all of the little different nuclei. It's going to then interpret the information that's coming in, and then it releases its releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, tells the pituitary to do its job. It releases its hormone, and then the ACTH will travel to the adrenal gland and release cortisol so that we can go run from our saber-toothed tiger that's no longer there, right? So if you don't meditate and exercise and learn deep breathing and listen to music so you know how to quiet out the world, if you don't actively quiet this down, it's going to actively control you, and it's going to destroy all of your physiological functions. So we have to learn to take control of our HPA loop. And the gut bugs are a very big part of that, because if we lose that balance and we start to have GI dysfunction and we start to have stress, that's a big feedback loop. So it's going to be very important. So we are going to look at the stimulatory loop, which is what we just discussed. Okay, the stimulation is the hypothalamus gets information. The information is then interpreted, and then its decision, its response is stress alert. So it gets told, I need to activate, right? So the signals come in, that feedback, whatever the peripheral body is telling it needs to do, it's then stimulated. It goes through the CRH to the pituitary, through the adrenal cortex, and we get the cortisol, right? So we need it to stop. It's supposed to stop, right? Again, if you're not actively learning how to stress manage, you're going to be under a constant load of excessive HPA. You have to learn to quiet it down. All right, so what about the inhibitory loop, right? The inhibitory loop is going to be the feedback. Once the adrenal gland secretes the cortisol has its immediate effect. But then it reaches the brain back in serum, and then it acts on the hypothalamus as well as the pituitary, and also the hippocampus and other parts of the brain, especially the limbic system, which have receptors for the glucocorticoids, which also respond to excessive levels, and then it has its response. But what happens when the cortisol travels back up to the brain, it will then decrease the output, or it's supposed to at least, right? When you're functioning properly and you're not on adrenal burnout and you're not in a complete adrenal fatigue state, then a normal individual under normal stress who has normal mechanisms of normal stress management, their cortisol is going to inhibit more release of the corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So it's an inhibition. And then it also will then directly and indirectly inhibit the pituitary. So you have a downstream inhibition of your ACTH. And then you have less signal coming down to the adrenal glands to keep secreting. So the cortisol itself is going to stop being told to be synthesized and secreted, because the signal is no longer coming into the adrenal glands to pump out cortisol. So that's the stimulatory action, synthesis, right, release. And then the negative loop back is, once it's synthesized, then it's going to tell the gland telling it to release it to stop. And this is a very normal physiological mechanism of how our hormones work in our system. So it's in a physiological system that is working properly, you have that negative feedback loop. So this is a nice picture of the different nuclei of the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is fairly deep inside the brain. It's like, if you kind of like intersect it, like right there and touch where my two fingers are, it's like deep in there. Okay, so it's like way back, and we have to appreciate that we have receptors on the hypothalamus that are going to respond to the hormones. However, we also have receptors in the extra hypothalamic receptors, like I had just said, in the limbic system, that also can respond to the level. So if you have a hormone and you're going to have a response, it has to have a receptor. If you have a tissue and it doesn't have a receptor, then that hormone has nothing to bind to and it won't have a physiological effect. So parts of our brain, both the hypothalamic and the extra hypothalamic, have receptors that will respond and that the glucocorticoids can bind to have an effect and give it information. So we have a direct inhibition from our feedback loop to the hypothalamus itself, and then our extra hypothalamic, especially our limbic system, the amygdala and the hippocampus, as well as the frontal cortex, can also have an indirect inhibition to help down regulate the signal coming in. So here's a nice pretty picture of how deep it is, and I think Dr. Macchini does a wonderful job in neurology and neuroscience, so hopefully you remember from her where the hypothalamus is. So when we're talking about the cortisol response, outside of the stress response, we have a physiological circadian rhythm of basal normal amounts of cortisol that are released. So if you're not stressed, right? And if you're under just, or if you manage your stress and you're healthy physiologically, like okay, then we are still going to have this anticipated expected cortisol curve. This is something you can do on a saliva test, and people who are fatigued or adrenal burnout, there's different stages. Again, that's not what this lecture is about. However, just a quick a clinical pearl, we can use different saliva tests or collection of urine to monitor some of the stress hormones. Excuse me, my eye is itching, I'm sorry. And the tracking of it can tell us information about how the adrenals are doing and how the HPA axis is working. Because if the stress doesn't stop and if you don't manage it, then it just goes and goes and goes, and you can go from normal physiological function, then you have hypercortisol, and then that will go to hypo, where you just don't respond, and we call that adrenal burnout. So what we want to show here is this is a normal cortisol curve. So we see that in the morning, our normal physiological response is to have a high spike in secreted cortisol, and this is early morning, normally from like anywhere from like 5 to 8, right? And then throughout the day, it decreases. Normally in the afternoon, you get a tiny little bump that's very typical, and I guess that's like post-lunch. And then typically it declines, and then by the end of the evening, it should be at the lowest levels. Any deviation from this curve will cause symptoms. And we've shown that people with insomnia and people who don't manage their stress, they will have a spike right here, and that can cause significant problems. So this curve is very important when we are looking at a normal cortisol and HPA axis physiological rhythm, okay? So what we want to understand is that if we are going to be stimulating the adrenal glands, what does that exactly mean? I mean, they're like the size of a pea. They're like these tiny little things, and they are so powerful. And there are two zones that basically are going to be what we need to pay attention to in regards to the stress response, because they are equal in the output. Okay, so we have our adrenal cortex that's going to respond to the ACTH coming from the pituitary, and then the response from the adrenal cortex is going to secrete the glucocorticoid, primarily cortisol. It also secretes DHEA, and that is not the topic of the conversation. So the other part of the adrenal gland is going to be the adrenal medulla, and this is the portion that is your sympathetic portion, and that's going to secrete your neurotransmitter norepinephrine, but primarily epinephrine, which is the opposite of the gut. Remember, the gut is going to be sympathetic, which is going to be more norepinephrine, but it also responds to epinephrine. However, the adrenal gland is going to primarily secrete and synthesize the epinephrine. So if you remember, as a brief review, there we go, then you have in your neurotransmitter pathway, epinephrine is the last stage of the catecholamines. So dopamine, and then norepinephrine, and then epinephrine. So we're going to see that the adrenal gland is going to convert very actively pre-made norepinephrine into epinephrine. So here is the adrenal gland, and you can see that there are two areas, primarily your adrenal cortex. That's going to be, excuse me, that's going to be your cortisol as well as some of the DHEA. Again, we're primarily focusing on the glucocorticoid cortisol. And then the adrenal medulla is going to be your epinephrine, norepinephrine, and those are your catecholamines. So this is pretty cool. This is fairly new literature. And we have learned that it is not just cortisol stimulation. The two regions are intimately coordinated, and one effect has the effect on the other. So when cortisol gets synthesized and is responding to the pituitary's, the brain central nervous system's signal to secrete cortisol, once that signal is instigated, it takes 3 minutes. 3 minutes is all it takes for that steroid pathway to get active and pump out cortisol. And your cortisol can increase in your serum like up to 20-fold in like a rapid amount of time. Again, remember, the body back in the evolution times, you're running from a saber-toothed tiger. You don't have time to go, should I run, right? You're like, crap, run. Okay, and that's how fast it happens. So when the cortisol is being secreted from that tiny little pea pod of an adrenal gland, the adrenal medulla is like right there. And then the cortisol secretion instantly tells the medulla to go, yo, buddy, I need some norepinephrine and epinephrine, and you get this immediate secretion. So basically, this little pea-sized gland, it's not exactly the size of a pea, this pea-sized gland is going to secrete both cortisol and epinephrine in like a split second. So the cortisol secretion also paracrine form type of like reactivity tells the gland right there to also secrete the neurotransmitter, which is the sympathetic reaction. Now, stress also directly stimulates the sympathetic. However, the gland itself is going to be very intimately involved in response to the brain's response. So cortisol is co-released with epinephrine, right? And together, these stress hormones initiate physiological and behavioral responses. And this close localization enables cell-to-cell paracrine. Remember, paracrine is when hormones act locally. So this is a really great excerpt out of Dr. Gwilliams's textbook, and it's explaining that the sympathetic medulla is going to respond directly. And these are going to be preformed. So even though the epinephrine has to be, it takes one step of methylation to convert norepinephrine into epinephrine. That's your SAMe, acetylenolmethionine reaction, just remembering it. And that is going to be preformed, right? So the difference is when we're talking about the cortisol is not preformed. It's not just sitting around ready to be secreted. However, it is the steroid pathway, and it starts with your cholesterol. So cholesterol is going to be converted into pregnenolone, and then pregnenolone goes through this beautiful, like sideways biochemical reaction into cortisol. And the interesting thing is, in order to have your gonadal sex hormones of your testosterone, your estrogen, your progesterone, you have to be able to get your pregnenolone to go through the synthesis of cortisol into the gonadal hormones for those to work. And if you have too much stress, guess what happens? Your stress pathway, it steals it down. It doesn't let you get testosterone. It doesn't let you get the estrogen and progesterone. So this pathway is very important in so many different realms, but for our discussion of gut-brain health, we need to understand that the pregnenolone is going to go into cortisol, and that takes about 3 minutes. So as soon as the ACTH reaches the adrenal cortex, it instantly kicks on the cyclic AMP, which stimulates your protein kinase, and that's pretty much your activating step. And then you ramp up your cortisol, that steroid cycle goes, and then you have a 20-fold increase. Now, the interesting thing about the cortisol is it does, for a hormone, it does have a fairly long half-life. It lasts about 60 to 90 minutes. So now remember, not only is it acting on the target tissues, it's also having a response in the brain. So for it to last for 60 to 90 minutes means it's passing through several times, which is not necessarily always the case with some of our other hormones. So you basically have a physical and mental stress induced with equally rapid increase. Physical and mental stress equally stimulated. If you are not controlling your stress and your anger and your resentment and all of those negative emotions that come in with stress, or past life that you haven't dealt with, guess what? You are in a constant cortisol sympathetic dominance. So you definitely have to appreciate that digestion is going to be inhibited if you are angry and not appreciative and not sitting down to eat and not taking the time. And all of those sympathetic reactions are going to override the parasympathetic rest and digest. So if you are under physical or mental stress, you need to really take a minute before you sit and eat, because your sympathetic response is going to have a negative impact on your gut. If you remember right out of the Guyton medical physiology, your sympathetic release can be so potent that it stops, it halts any motility of the digestive system. Not slows it down, not kind of like dampens it, it literally stops it. That's insane. That's definitely gut disbalance. Okay, so cortisol's effect is going to have gluconeogenesis, lipolysis, proteinolysis, right? So what's that mean? You're going to start pumping glucose out into the blood, then you're going to start breaking down your muscle, and you're going to start breaking down fat, right? You're running from the saber-toothed tiger. What are you not doing? You're not digesting and you're not procreating. So not only can you not digest if you are in sympathetic dominance, you definitely cannot get pregnant, nor even attempt to try the act of it, because it just won't work. So the other thing that happens is going to be your cortisol directly stimulates the adrenal medulla to synthesize and secrete its epinephrine. So this is a beautiful opening statement from the article, Adrenergic Responses to Stress. Wonderful article, full text, open access. I recommend reading it. And basically it says the classic symptoms of the adrenaline rush, right? This is a massive surge of epinephrine, and this permits us to, I like this, meet the challenge of a stress and conquer it, right? That is our fight or flight. And what we are going to see is that the conversion of norepinephrine is going to be stimulated through the PNMT, which is one of the COMT. It's a form of the methyltransferase that initiates the conversion of norepinephrine into our epinephrine, which is our adrenaline. And that's done so by your SAMe. So basically stress comes along, it stimulates the enzyme to do the conversion. That is your biosynthetic enzyme that generates epinephrine, which is your adrenaline. So stress directly activates it. The splanchnic nerve, and the splanchnic nerve is going to be part of the gut system as well as through the spine. And then your elevated glucocorticoids as well. So if you have that cortisol stimulus, it's going to directly stimulate the PNMT to generate epinephrine and start to secrete the adrenaline into the system. So both surge at the same time as a coordinated effort. So what happens when we have the stress response, right? So fear, anger, negative emotions, injury, basically anything you can think of is going to stimulate your stress response. That activates your hypothalamus and your limbic system, it, which then downstream HPA initiate your adrenal cortex as well as your adrenal medulla. And then we're going to actually have different effects on metabolism. Now, cortisol here is being shown to activate the digestive system. However, we know that the symbiosis of the secretion of the sympathetic neurotransmitters is then going to have an overriding effect on the parasympathetic. So when you are under stress, you are not digesting and you are not procreating. Very important. So the activation is a co-activation. So a lot of times, again, we learn HPA axis is hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, but we have to remember that the adrenal is not just the cortisol, it is the sympathetic adrenal, which is the SAS, that is your catecholamines and your norepinephrine, epinephrine, and they are being secreted together. So be sure you recognize that catecholamines, again, is the same, it's the term for your stress hormones, norepinephrine, epinephrine, which are noradrenaline and adrenaline. So here's another picture. This is from Adrenal Gland Microenvironment, another really great article. So your hypothalamus is going to stimulate the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland itself is going to both secrete glucocorticoids as well as secrete catecholamines. That's why I like this article, because it talks about the co-secretion. And then as soon as you have your glucocorticoids, yes, it stimulates your catecholamine response, but it also then has that negative feedback loop where you're directly inhibiting both the hypothalamus as well as inhibiting the directly and indirectly inhibiting the pituitary gland. In a normal situation, in a normal individual with a normal stress response and a normal HPA, this is what happens. So what are the stressors then, right? So we know that injury, we know that trauma, emotional stress, right? Environmental, chemical stress, emotional stress, social stress. All of these have been independently proven in medical literature to activate your HPA axis. Infection, intense heat and cold, trauma, injury, surgery, even restraint. They basically take rodents and lock them down and then see how much stress is released, and it's actually quite a lot. So stress response to being restrained, or in the human world, you know, now, well, you can think of that, and if you're, that could be emotional as well. So when you break down what stress is on a molecular level, stress is cytokines, eicosanoids, free radicals, right? Because what is happening when all of these are studied metabolically and molecularly is their cytokines, eicosanoids, and activation of your transcription factors that increase your stress response. Why is this important? Why am I really focusing on cytokines in regards to our HPA axis? Because what do you think is telling the hypothalamus to go crazy and start responding? Your eicosanoids, your prostaglandins, thromboxanes, leukotrienes, your N6, your series 2 and 4 are some of your primary activators of the HPA axis. So you take a body habitus that has a whole bunch of omega-6 because they don't eat well, right? And then they're overweight and they have hyperglycemia and they have free radicals and they're low in antioxidants. Guess what? They're a cesspool of pro-inflammatory modulators, upregulated phospholipase A2, upregulated COX and LOX, a whole host of oxidative stress, reactive and nitrogen species, and a body habitus of walking excessive inflammatory cytokines. And then you add on top of it not managing fighting with your spouse or financial stress, or, you know, a bird pooped on my new clean car, or my neighbor's dog keeps barking in the morning, right? These things like never go away. So you have a multitude of cytokines and eicosanoids and free radicals, and all of those stimulate, upregulate the genome to turn on more and more nuclear factor kappa B transcription of pro-inflammatory genes and enzymes systems, and then you get more and more pro-inflammatory cytokines, and it just is a complete barrage of the hypothalamic response. So clinicians must be mindful of chronic inflammatory signaling from any source when considering how the HPA stress response axis is activated, right? If you're not meditating and not being angry at the world and angry at everything that happens and managing your mood and your negative emotions and getting rid of self-negativity, it's going to control you and it's going to activate you at the level of the brain. So you have to have your stress response and your mechanisms intact. Look at this. Inflammatory bowel, food allergies, intestinal permeability and leaky gut, dysbiosis, bacterial, candida, and parasites, joint inflammation, autoimmune diseases, airborne allergies, asthma, sinusitis, rheumatoid diseases, joint diseases, obesity, metabolic, cardiovascular, kind of like everything, right? If you don't control your stress, it will take over. Cool. All right, so where's it boil down to? Inflammation, cytokines, not enough antioxidants, not enough meditation, not chewing your food good enough. Chew your food, right? So stress stimulators are like everything. So I added to the list here cytokines, like eicosanoids, nuclear factor kappa B. Anything that turns those on are going to ultra aggravate your stress response. Leaky gut, dysbiosis, right? Leaky gut. What is leaky gut? It's the loss of the intact barrier. Those are the zona occludens of the enterocytes where the desmosomes are sitting next to the tight junction. And then you have those little rubber band like they're kind of like a skeletal muscle contractile unit, right? That pulls and contracts and pulls and contracts. So if you don't have a healthy intact zona occludens, then you've got leaky gut where your intestinal lining is like, it's all like wonky. And then you're going to have food pathogens stimulating your GALT. And then as soon as you stimulate your GALT, you're going to have reactions to food. And that's your IgG hypersensitivity reaction, which is right here. And then you have dysbiosis. And it's all just this conglomerate. It all happens together and it's all the time. And you don't just get one, right? One leads to the other and it's just this mess. So chew your food, make sure you have stomach acid, wean yourself off of the proton pump inhibitors, get rid of the antacid and supplement with a digestive enzyme. Make sure it has the ox bile and the pancreatic enzyme so that you can have a healthy, functional digestive response. And then make sure you have a good gut microbiome, because all of this, if this happens in your gut, this is going to cause stress in your hypothalamus. If you have stress in your hypothalamus, it's going to cause ease. So this is where we know that the gut barrier, intestinal lining, zona occludens, zonulin, gluten-free, all of these things, the mucus lining, the secretory IgA, the protection of the gut barrier, all of these come into play to protect our bodies from not having excessive barrage of microbes. Because as soon as the microbes penetrate the GALT, and as soon as the microbes, gosh forbid, they get into the circulation, they can take a V line to the liver and they can cross the blood-brain barrier, and then the lipopolysaccharides of their outer coating give a huge immune response. And then again, all of a sudden, you have not just gut problems. People can have all of this and not have a necessarily like gas. They could have a rash, or they could have headaches, or they could have brain fog. All of it goes back to disrupted barrier, going back and forth in a bidirectional manner with an overactive hypothalamic response. So what does this mean for stress? Number one, take your natural anti-inflammatories. Make sure you're taking your fish oil, because look at this. Release of prostaglandins stimulates the HPA axis. Yeah, duh, we just said that. COX and LOX inhibitors led to a complete blockage of ACTH and corticosterone secretion. COX and LOX inhibition, modulating turmeric, boswellia, curcumin, white willow, right? Flavonoids, those modulate your coxsackie locks, and those are going to help decrease some of that stress response. It's going to modulate it just like it does for trigger points or pain or disease and degeneration. It also acts at the level of your central nervous system. So it's important to understand that the stress, inflammatory, cytokines, eicosanoids, physical, mental, social, any type of stress is going to all be activators of the hypothalamic response. The stress is going to directly activate the sympathetic, directly stimulate the norepinephrine, epinephrine response of the medulla, and then the cortisol itself is going to then, bi-directionally, paracrine manner, stimulated as well. So you have this barrage of the axis. So now that we understand how the feedback works, both stimulatory and inhibitory, as well as both catecholamine and glucocorticoid, now we can see what does this really mean for the gut biome, right? So why is the stress response in the HPA part of the gut-brain axis, the GBA? So the limbic system is going to be hypothalamus, hippocampus, amygdala, and they're all interconnected. And we already said they all have glucocorticoid receptors, so that when you have the cortisol in the serum, they can be stimulated by the cortisol, and that can actually influence their effect, right? So then you have the enteric nervous system, and that's going to be everything we already learned. The enteric nervous system is your acetylcholine response, your parasympathetic and sympathetic, and then that's going to control afferent, efferent, motility, secretions, mucus, and immunity. And then the microbiota is a bi-directional communication. So the gut bugs are going to influence the local environment, and then that's going to change how these cells respond and what they secrete. And what they secrete will then stimulate the afferent of the enteric, and then that's going to take it upward to the brain and basically deliver the messages to the limbic system. So depending on what microbiota abundance and diversity or lack thereof or excessive thereof is going to directly influence what they secrete, what they aggravate, what they synthesize, right? They're our buddies and they give us good stuff, and then they can also get out of balance, or we can have the wrong species in the wrong place, and then all of that and what they do is going to aggravate the mucosa or help the mucosa, aggravate the neurotransmitters or help the neurotransmitters, aggravate and steal our nutrients because there's too much of them and it's nutrient competition, or they're going to make it for us when they're in the right place in the colon. So everything that the biota does responds with their secretions or their dominance or their presence. It activates the vagal nerve, and then that is going to take communication up to the brain. And then the brain in return, if you're aggravated, if you're angry, if you're happy, depending on all of the different limbic and emotional and outward responses, then directly influence intestinal permeability, motility, secretions. So if you don't have a good downward response and you're not secreting, then you might not have a healthy barrier. So it goes hand in hand. So the bugs are going to be responding to what the brain is telling the motility and secretion to do. Remember, they're there just minding their own business. They just happen to be doing us like a really good physiological favor. We need them there. However, if they're just waiting for our gut micro habitat to make sure that they're all like nestled and happy. So if our brain doesn't tell our gut to do what it's supposed to do, and our lifestyle and dietary habits don't support what it's supposed to do, then all they're going to do is just respond to their environment. That is your gut-brain bidirectional communication. So what we need to appreciate is that the bidirectional is all the time. It's continuous. The brain receives constant input of different stimuli and signals from the GI tract, and it initiates the appropriate integrated response. The gut-brain axis consists of the bidirectional communication between the central and enteric nervous system, linking emotional and cognitive centers to the peripheral intestinal functions. So the crosstalk is so important. And if you don't have a healthy vagal response, then you're not going to have a healthy gut. If you have a dysbiosis and an unhealthy gut, you're going to have overstimulation and too much signaling of the vagal nerve, which is going to carry that information up. So we literally coordinate signals of food intake, motility secretion, you already knew, inflammatory response, and mucal defense, all according to the gut bugs and their secretion of neurotransmitters and peptides that are basically responding and activating the receptors of the vagal nerve. The enteroendocrine cells are the neurotransmitter secreting cells of the gut. They are synthesized from your enterocyte stem cells. They're a turnover, and they literally sit adjacent to the vagal afferents, and when they secrete their peptides and their neurohormones and neurotransmitters, then that stimulates the vagal nerve, then vagal nerve takes that boom right up to the brain. So it is the crosstalk that is happening. So we know that the enteroendocrines, as I had just said, they come from the stem cells and they grow up from the crypts, restricted to the mucosa. There's a couple cool pictures, and then I did a 2-minute video from Duke University. I just learned that they're called neuropods. That's pretty cool. I didn't even know that. So boom, new information. Populations are different from the upper versus the lower. A lot of it is going to be signaling. So in the upper, remember, nutrients are coming in, bioavailability, and then in the distal gut, you've got more, you're looking for more like fermentation and such. So remember, the geography is different from upper versus lower, and that's very important in the types of signaling that are going up and down from brain to gut, gut to brain. So the enteroendocrine cells are going to be absent for a big portion of the middle bowel, and then they're going to explode again in the rectum. And primarily the rectum is going to be where majority of the serotonin is going to be synthesized for motility. Remember, we need healthy bowel movements and we need motility, and most of that is going to be coordinated through your serotonin and your enteroendocrine cells telling your vagal nerve what to do, basically. So here's a nice picture. We've seen this before. So intermixed in the microvilli are going to be the enteroendocrine cells, and those are going to be lodged in with your different enterocytes. And as you can see, your goblets, which secrete your mucus, your different immune cells are spread throughout, and they are going to be dispersed throughout. And if you look at this again, now this picture doesn't necessarily show it, but where the vagal nerve comes in is it's going to, its nerve terminals are going to be like boop, 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 like right in there. And that's how when it secretes, it responds to different signaling, nutrient availability and chemical irritation, motility, then it's going to, the enteroendocrine cell secretes, and then their secretory products stimulate the vagal afferents. All right, so what we know is that these are the signals, right? So brain, microbiota to brain, back to brain. We're going to have neurotransmitters and the metabolites. Your metabolites could even be your like your butyrate, your propionate. Yes, it feeds the colonocytes, but it also can act as signaling to the to activate the vagal nerve and to give information through the different nervous systems. And then of course we're going to modulate sensory afferents, right? That's information that's going to go up to the brain as an afferent. And then we regulate the immune cells and the intestinal barrier. This is so important for gut health, right? So in addition, we have the opposite. We have brain going to the gut. And again, as I had said, that's going to be the microhabitat that the gut bugs are depending on. They don't come and ask us if they can have a mucus layer. They don't come and ask us if they can be in our large intestine or small intestine. They're just there. And if we give them environment to overgrow, then they're going to overgrow. And if we kill the good guys and we allow the opportunistic and the more robust strains to survive, then that's what's going to be populated. So everything that we do, emotional as well as dietary, and bowel movements and digestion, it all goes hand in hand into what the microbiome is going to do and how they exist inside of us. So when we are looking at some of the influences, if we do not have a healthy response, then we're going to lose the intestinal barrier. If we don't have a healthy response, we're going to have the hormones, neurotransmitters, and biological amines that they are secreting out of balance. If we don't have a healthy biome, then we're not going to have enough, or we're going to have too much of the short chain fatty acids. So we need these in balance. So if we have dysbiosis, these are the things that go wrong, right? Homeostasis is normal functioning, and then disease, pain, and degeneration is nothing more than these functions being lost, right? So the gut bugs are going to be helping our intestinal barrier. The lacto and the bifido directly do it, and they also restore and sustain our tight junctions. Tight junctions are gut barrier. That is the zona occludens. And then we also have the nutrient sensing, and when we look at some of the metabolic disorders, we'll see that diabetes and metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance is also hypothalamic resistance, and we stop responding to some of the signals. And then that in itself is not only gut dysbiosis, that's brain dysbiosis. I thought this was cool. I do eat meat and I do love beef, so I liked this. Mice fed with a diet containing 50% lean beef versus a rodent chow had a greater diversity and presented with an increase in physical activity, memory, and less anxiety-like behavior. Now, it's simply saying that diversity of the gut biome improved physical activity, memory, and less anxiety. It really had nothing to do with beef. I just like beef. And it just said that diversity of the gut. We have to have diversity, we have to have abundance. And when we have diversity and when we have abundance, we have a healthier life, okay? That is quality of life. We don't have to live to 120, but however long your life is, you should be happy and healthy and feel good and be active. Because disease and pain and degeneration is the alternative. And then you're still gonna live that long, you're just gonna feel like crap, right? It doesn't sound like much fun. So the intestinal barrier, right? We've hounded this. Pre-treatment of animals with probiotic combined formulations of lacto and bifido restored tight junction barrier integrity and attenuated the HPA axis and autonomic nervous system activities assessed through plasma cortisol and catecholamines. That is a positive. We definitely want to be supporting our Firmicutes and our Bacteroids, and that is primarily through lacto and bifido, as well as bacillus spore. Don't forget bacillus. So what are we looking at with brain to gut? So now we're going to go the opposite direction, right? We've been looking at what the biome does and how it signals through the vagal nerve, but now the brain down to the gut. So this functional gut is going to be a backwards ratio. We want more Firmicutes than Bacteroids, and diabetes, obesity, poor diets, Western diets, they actually cause a reverse. And as we get into more of the dysfunctional bowel syndromes and Rome criteria, we're going to see how that plays out. But dysbiosis is associated with an opposite. We want more Firmicutes than Bacteroids, and we can supplement with probiotics, and then we can also make sure we eat healthy to support that. So human host neurotransmitters stimulate bacteria. What? Let me say that again in case you didn't catch that. Human host neurotransmitters stimulate bacteria, just like a hormone, right? If you don't have a tissue that has a receptor, then it can't respond to it. So you could send a hormone to a tissue that doesn't have a receptor, and it does absolutely nothing. You have to have a receptor binding spot. our gut bugs, microbiotic bugs, respond to human neurotransmitters with receptors. That's mind blowing. I think that is so cool. So, human host neurotransmitters stimulate bacteria. Several microbiota possess receptors that respond to host neurotransmitters. Pseudomonas and E. coli, certain strains, have receptors that respond to, look at that, norepinephrine and epinephrine. Guess what that is? That's a stress response. Guess what that's also? That's also not digestion. These guys go buck wild when you have a stress response. You're like, woohoo, it's a party, and they're going to explode in your gut, and then you have dysbiosis. So manage your stress and chew your food, right? You don't want excessive populations of Pseudomonas and E. coli. You want healthy populations, not excessive. So they like to mop up all of your epinephrine, so manage your stress. Excess of these species induced predisposition to inflammatory signaling. Yeah, not only do they explode and just go buck wild in there, they also make you inflamed. They make you totally inflamed. And then what happens when you have an inflammatory gut? You stimulate your HPA axis. How convenient for them, right? They're like, yeah, we got this down. So manage your stress, chew your food. All right, so the central nervous system is going to control the mucosal habitat. They will help keep the mucus and the microbiome, the biofilm, working. Dysfunctional efferents are going to disrupt that habitat. If you don't have normal signaling, you're going to have an abnormal gut microbiome, because we need that central nervous system stimulation to maintain integrity of the gut lining. And when that is disrupted, so is the gut. Once you lose mucosal protection, you have chemical irritation, you have dysbiosis, and basically you're walking IBD. That is inflammatory bowel disease, as we will learn once you lose the mucosal lining. Your efferent controls motility. Well, we already knew that. Stress disrupts both gastric emptying and your migrating motor complex. Remember, the migrating motor complex only works during fasting. If you go to bed on a full stomach, you can also shut down the ability of that. It's a contractile wave that clears the intestines and pushes the food further down in a propulsion. And in a non-feeding period, that migrating motor complex activates both secretions and motility. You'll get a little like burst of digestive enzymes and acids to make sure that it's downstream clearing any food material, food particles that are still in the intestines. And if you don't have a healthy migrating motor complex and gastric emptying, then you're going to end up with overgrowth of the gut biome and colic and all types of imbalances. So super important. And then the central nervous system efferent also controls the intestinal permeability. Once you lose permeability, you're just a walking mess. I mean, it really is the key to like health, or lack thereof. Increased permeability increases bacterial antigens stimulating your gut. Right. What did I say early on, and 1,000 other times before this, is you don't want the food particles stimulating the immune system, the gut that's in between the enterocytes. You want to have as little excessive stimulation as possible. And then acute stress, especially interferon, directly decreased the zona includens and induced leaky gut. So again, I mean, there's you have to work really hard at maintaining the gut barrier, and you can do that through stress management and chewing your food. Okay, so what happens with stress? Major effects of stress on gut physiology. You need to know all 6. I hope that this is a review, but this is a wonderful article called Stress and Gut. You should read this whole article. I think it's wonderful. So, alterations in GI motility, increased visceral perception. That basically means that normal food in the gut that does not irritate a normal person will irritate you. If you have colic and cramping and your stomach always hurts and food gives you a bellyache and bowel movements hurt, you have visceral hypersensitivity. So that's not something you want because it hurts. You have changes in your GI secretion, increased permeability, that's activation of your gut and leaky gut. And you have negative effects on the regenerative capacity. You are not going to be overturning your gut lining as well. And if you can't heal your gut, then you're a mess, right? Negative effects on the microbiota. So motility, secretions, permeability, regeneration, microbiota, and increased sensitivity of the gut to pain receptors. So exposure to stress results in alterations of the gut, including IBD, inflammatory bowel disease, IBS, inflammatory bowel syndrome. We'll be studying those momentarily. Functional GI disorders, including dysbiosis and SIBO, small intestinal bowel overgrowth. We will be studying those. Food antigen and IgG sensitivities, peptic ulcer, and GERD. All of these are included when we are talking about loss of microbiome and excessive HPA access. So it is so important to understand what the gut biome is doing. You can read that on your own. That's a really great explanation of dysbiosis. So a germ-free model in an animal, basically, number one, they don't thrive. They took a germ-free model, induced autism in the animal, and then gave it a fecal transplant and gave it a healthy microbiome, and all of the autism disorder behaviors ceased. So they are demonstrating that you can have behavioral problems, especially linked with, the autism spectrum. That's a multitude of different etiologies and behavioral presentations, and it can tie back to having an imbalanced gut. So when they had a germ-free model, they found that the enteric nervous system as well as the central nervous system did not properly develop. You have to have exposure in those early developmental days to have a normal functioning enteric nervous system, which is just as big as the central nervous system. So once they did bacterial colonization, all of the anomalies went away. So they had an exaggerated stress response and an excessive HPA secretion. And when they did the bacterial colonization, they gave the germ-free animals the microbiota. They totally normalized. And then they also demonstrated that there was excessive serotonin turnover, which is mood, anxiety, and depression. And once they normalized it with recolonization, all of that improved. And then the memory is coordinated with a wonderful neurotropic called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and that is a very heavily secreted in your hippocampus, and it's related to different types of memory and recall. And the hippocampus has been shown to have a negative BDNF and negative memory function when there is a dysbiosis, coordinated back to that gut biome, gut axis, because of the receptors that are in the limbic system. So when all of the different tests of the germ-free animals and all of the aberrant behaviors and dysfunctions that were shown, they all corrected, they all normalized once the animals had colonization of the gut. Basically, they got a fecal transplant, the microbiota was introduced into the germ-free animals, and then their disease went away. I think that is absolutely phenomenal. So this last part is just a few medical studies demonstrating that the gut-brain axis is coordinated, clinically correlated in both your upper and your lower GI syndromes, highly coordinated in your mood disorders. It's also very highly clinically connected to both chronic disease as well as autoimmunity. So here's a great article that's talking about the different types of disease correlated to gut bugs. So surprisingly, perturbation to the composition and function of the gut microbiota has been associated with chronic diseases ranging from GI, inflammatory, and metabolic conditions to neurological, cardiovascular, and respiratory. There's basically no system left untouched that has been shown to not be influenced by the gut-brain axis and the microbiota. It really is the key to health. and chewing and stress management, of course, right? If you remember nothing, remember to chew and stress manage. All right, so this is a really cool picture. I know you've seen 1,000 of the intestinal gut linings. There's your mucus layer, and there's our nice little gut bugs living in their microhabitat of the mucus layers and that region where we want them to be. So, role of the gut microbiota in health and chronic GI, understanding the hidden metabolic organ. This is a really great article as well. And once you restore the gut biome, the disease states go away. Basically, that's as easy as it gets. They restored esophageal microbiota and basically reversed the development of esophageal cancer. This is going to be bipolar was basically reversed, and bipolar disorder is highly correlated with imbalances in certain species. So dysbiosis is in depression and anxiety and your mood disorders. Here's another one talking about the mood disorders. So this is a really great article as well. This is going to summarize neurobiochemical, neuroendocrine, and neuroimmune system mechanisms of the gut-brain axis and how it correlates to mood from your microbiota. So if you want to have any form of mental health in your clinic and you want to work with people who have anxiety and stress, you would definitely want to download this article. This is a free full text. Then, of course, autoimmune is basically it comes from your gut. If you didn't have it when you were born and you developed it later in life, you very likely have a dysbiosis. And multitude of medical studies have definitely clinically correlated the onset of autoimmunity and or the aggravation of it with gut health. And you might not be able to get rid of autoimmunity. However, you can quiet it down and keep it in a quiescent state. And it all starts with gut health and chewing and stress management, of course. All right, well, I hope you learned a lot about your gut and your brain, and I hope you remember to manage your stress and chew your food.